There is a sound that a generation of British people carry somewhere in the back of their memory. Not a melody, not a voice. A low, rolling thunder crossing the sky, and if you looked up fast enough, you caught it. The needle nose, the delta wing. The impossible silhouette climbing away faster than your eyes could properly follow. Concorde. Even the name does something to people who were alive when it flew. And then, on the 24th of October, 2003, it landed at Heathrow, and it never flew again. The official story is tidy. There was a crash. The economics no longer worked. The aircraft was retired with dignity. Move along. That is not the real story. The real story begins in 1962, runs through broken treaties, catastrophic miscalculation, political cowardice, and a corporate decision that sealed Concorde's fate permanently long before the public ever understood what was happening. What you are about to hear is the part that gets left out. The brutal truth about why Concorde was killed, who did it, and how. In 1954, British engineers began serious research into supersonic passenger travel. The technology required was extraordinary. At sustained Mach 2 flight, the aircraft's aluminium skin would expand by as much as 7 inches during a transatlantic crossing. The temperatures, the pressures, the aerodynamic forces involved nothing like it had ever been attempted in a commercial context. By the early 1960s, the costs had already grown beyond what Britain could carry alone. A partner was needed. On the 29th of November, 1962, the United Kingdom and France signed a binding treaty committing both governments to build the aircraft together. The name chosen reflected the alliance: Concorde, agreement, harmony. It sounded noble, but buried inside that treaty was a sentence that would haunt both governments for the next 4 decades. There was no exit clause. The original estimated cost of the program was £70 million. By the time the first commercial passengers boarded, the bill had risen to over $1.4 billion for each country. Not combined, each. The British taxpayer alone funded a program that overshot its original estimate by a factor of more than 20. And the British government tried to escape. In the mid-1960s, with costs already spiraling far beyond any projection, ministers began looking for a way out. They found none. Withdrawing from the treaty would have caused a diplomatic crisis with France at precisely the moment Britain was attempting to join the European Economic Community. The politics made retreat impossible. So the money kept flowing, year after year, because walking away would have cost more than pressing on, not in pounds, but in prestige. This is the first and most important truth about why Concorde died. It was never truly a commercial project. It was a prestige project, wearing commercial clothing. And prestige projects have a fatal flaw. They are sustained by pride, not profit, and pride, eventually, runs out. While the governments committed themselves to spending whatever was necessary, the manufacturers needed the market to cooperate. To break even on development costs, they needed to sell approximately 150 aircraft. In the early 1960s, that seemed plausible. Airlines from around the world were placing options. Pan American, Trans World Airlines, Air India, Qantas, Japan Airlines, Continental, American, Braniff, United, Air Canada, too. At peak, 16 airlines had options on as many as 100 aircraft. The aviation world believed supersonic travel was the next inevitable step. The jet age had transformed flight in the 1950s. The supersonic age would do the same in the 1970s. Then, in January of 1973, Pan American cancelled. The publicly stated reason was that Concorde no longer met the airline's future requirements. The real numbers told a clearer story. The aircraft's price had risen from under $20 million to more than $46 million and was still climbing. A Boeing 747 carried 375 passengers at $25 million and burned a fraction of the fuel. Concorde carried 100 passengers at nearly twice the cost and consumed 2 to 3 times more fuel per flight. The mathematics were not complicated. Within hours of Pan Am's announcement, Trans World Airlines followed. Within weeks, every American carrier had withdrawn: Continental, American, Braniff, United. Air Canada was already gone. 16 airlines became 2 British Airways and Air France, the very operators whose governments had built the aircraft. The dream of a global supersonic fleet was finished before Concorde had carried a single paying passenger. But the governments pressed on, because the treaty said so. On the 2nd of March, 1969, Concorde made its first flight from Toulouse. Everything the engineers had promised, the aircraft delivered. It flew at Mach 2.04, twice the speed of sound at 60,000 feet. The ride was quieter inside than a conventional airliner at cruise, London to New York in 3 hours and 20 minutes. The same journey by subsonic aircraft took more than 7 hours. On the 21st of January, 1976, Concorde entered commercial service. British Airways flew from Heathrow to Bahrain. Air France flew from Paris to Rio de Janeiro. Supersonic passenger travel had arrived. And almost immediately, the walls closed in. The sonic boom had been a known problem for years. When an aircraft exceeds the speed of sound, it creates a continuous shockwave that strikes the ground like a physical blow, sudden, violent, felt as an explosion by anyone below. In 1973, the same year, the airline orders collapsed. The Federal Aviation Administration formally banned civilian supersonic flight over the continental United States. No exceptions. No timeline for review. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a death sentence for the planned route network. Nearly half of Concorde's intended routes crossed over land. Transatlantic flights were viable, the boom could be broken over the ocean. But routes across America, across Asia, across populated land, corridors gone permanently. Concorde was confined to the ocean, and on the ocean there were only so many viable routes. The one that worked was London to New York. It became Concorde's lifeline and its prison. By the late 1970s, both airlines had retreated to essentially one transatlantic structure. The aircraft, that was supposed to transform global aviation, was flying one rich man's shortcut across the North Atlantic, day after day, year after year. Without a mass market, the model became luxury. A one-way ticket in the 1990s cost $10,000, closer to $20,000 in today's money. The passengers were executives, celebrities, and anyone whose time was worth more than the price of a small car. British Airways and Air France targeted the highest end of the premium market and, against all reasonable expectation, made the economics work. But working and thriving are not the same thing, and the machine that kept Concorde flying was far more fragile than it appeared. The maintenance burden was staggering. By 2003, the aircraft required 57 hours of maintenance for every single hour of flight. A conventional commercial aircraft required roughly a tenth of that ratio. Concorde's maintenance costs represented approximately 50% of total operating expenses. Half of everything spent keeping the aircraft in the air went on keeping it capable of flight. The aircraft themselves were aging in ways that no engineering manual had anticipated. They had been built in the 1970s. The stresses of supersonic operation, the thermal expansion and contraction of every crossing, the unique vibration profile, the pressurization demands at 60,000 feet meant every component aged faster and differently than on any other commercial aircraft ever operated. Engineers were working in unprecedented territory with every inspection cycle, and the manufacturers needed to sell aircraft to fund that knowledge base. They sold 14 revenue aircraft. 14. 2 to Air France, 4 to British Airways, the rest transferred to the airlines at prices that did not recover development costs. One of the Air France aircraft, by several accounts, changed hands for 1 French franc. The British and French governments spent over $2 billion in public money to produce 14 revenue-generating aircraft, operating one route, serving roughly 40,000 passengers per year. At the height of its commercial operation, Concorde was carrying fewer people annually than a single Boeing 747 flying the same route every day would carry. The most famous aircraft in history was, in terms of volume, a niche product. And yet, when it flew over your house, you went outside to look. When it appeared at an air show, the crowd stopped breathing. No aircraft before or since has produced that response from people who never flew on it and could never afford to. Simply knowing it was up there above the weather, crossing the ocean at twice the speed of sound, meant something to people personally. That irrational love was Concorde's greatest asset, and no balance sheet could protect it. The morning of the 25th of July, 2000, Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport. Air France Flight 4590, registration FBTSC, was cleared for departure carrying 100 passengers and 9 crew, mostly German tourists bound for New York to join a Caribbean cruise. 5 minutes before the Concorde lined up on runway 26 right, a Continental Airlines DC-10 had taken off from the same surface. As it accelerated, a titanium alloy wear strip from one of its engine thrust reversers worked loose and fell onto the tarmac. The strip was a replacement part, fitted with an alloy that did not meet the original specification, a piece of metal less than 40 centimeters long, lying on a runway. The Concorde rolled over it at full speed. The strip struck the left main undercarriage tire, causing catastrophic disintegration. A fragment of rubber struck the underside of the wing at extraordinary velocity and ruptured fuel tank number 5. Burning fuel began pouring from the wing. The left side engines began losing power. The crew could not abort. At that speed, on that runway, there was no option other than to climb and attempt to manage the emergency airborne. Captain Christian Marty pulled the aircraft into the air. It rose barely, no more than 200 feet. The second left side engine failed. With 2 engines gone and the aircraft on fire, there was nothing left. 90 seconds after leaving the ground, Air France Flight 4590 rolled, stalled, and fell from the sky onto a hotel in the Paris suburb of Gonesse. All 100 passengers, all 9 crew, 4 people on the ground, 113 dead. A photograph taken from a nearby aircraft, showing Concorde climbing through smoke with a river of fire trailing from its wing, was on the front page of every newspaper in the world within hours. And it destroyed, in a single image, 24 years of Concorde's unblemished safety record. That record was genuine. In 24 years of commercial supersonic operation, all the structural demands, all the extreme temperatures, all the unprecedented stresses of regular Mach 2 flight, not a single passenger or crew member had died. By statistical measure, Concorde was one of the safest commercial aircraft ever operated. All of that was obliterated by a piece of metal that fell off another airline's aircraft. The investigation concluded in January 2002. The cause was clear: the titanium strip from the Continental DC-10. A French court convicted Continental Airlines and one of its mechanics of involuntary manslaughter in 2010, though that conviction was later overturned on appeal. Both airlines grounded the entire fleet immediately. For 15 months, the most famous aircraft in the world sat on the tarmac. £71 million were spent on safety modifications, Kevlar fuel tank liners, reinforced tires, protected electrical systems. On the 7th of November, 2001, Concorde returned to service. 27 days earlier, on the 11th of September, the world had changed. Now, if this story is worth your time, this is the moment to subscribe to Nostalgic Britain, hit the button, turn on notifications, and never miss a story like this one. And leave a comment below. Do you remember Concorde? Did you ever see it fly? We read every single one. If someone you know should hear this history, share it with them right now. The attacks of September 11, 2001 did not kill Concorde directly, but they accelerated a collapse that was already quietly underway. The transatlantic premium market, the only market Concorde had ever served, went into freefall. Companies cut travel budgets overnight. Executives stopped flying. The corporate traveler, who had been willing to spend $10,000 to shave 4 hours off a journey, was now either grounded by policy or simply absent from the booking system. Concorde returned from its safety modifications to seats that were not filling. And empty seats on Concorde were a different problem than empty seats on other aircraft. On a Boeing 747, you could fill 2/3 of the cabin and still generate a profit. Concorde's extraordinary operating costs meant the break-even load factor was brutally high. The margins had always been thin. Now they were vanishing. By early 2003, British Airways had in some cases been restricting advance bookings to 50 passengers per flight, so that if a service had to be cancelled for maintenance reasons, all passengers could be accommodated in first class on a subsonic alternative. On the day British Airways announced Concorde's retirement in April 2003, there were reportedly 20 passengers on board that morning's service. The airline's chief executive, Rod Eddington, was direct. Passenger revenue was falling steadily against a backdrop of rising maintenance costs. Detailed discussions with Airbus had confirmed the need for an enhanced maintenance program in the coming years. The investment required could not be justified against the revenue trajectory. The decision, Eddington stated, was based on a long-term trend, not on any single event. Air France made its announcement on the 9th of April, 2003. British Airways followed one day later. Both fleets would retire by the end of October. On the 24th of October, 2003, 3 Concorde aircraft flew into Heathrow in close formation, a piece of theatre organized with characteristic precision. The crowds on the viewing terraces were enormous. People stood in tiers. The BBC carried the landings live. Former crew, former passengers, former engineers watched from the tarmac. The aircraft, that had been the symbol of British capability, touched down for the last time. The engines wound down. The needle nose rose into its droop position. It never flew again. But here is the detail that the official tributes consistently omit. Several serious groups came forward in the months following the retirement announcement, with formal proposals to purchase the Concorde fleet and continue operations privately. One consortium in the United States had investors, a team of experienced operators, and a route plan. They wanted to buy the aircraft and keep supersonic travel alive. Airbus declined to transfer the airworthiness certificate to any independent operator. Without manufacturer support, no civil aviation authority in the world would certify the aircraft for commercial service. The operators could own the aeroplanes legally. They could not fly them legally. Richard Branson's Virgin Atlantic made a formal offer reportedly revised upward to £5 million per aircraft. Airbus would not support the transfer. The answer was no. Concorde was not retired because flying it had become impossible. It was retired because a manufacturer's decision made it impossible to certify. Step back from the individual events, and a pattern emerges that is uncomfortable to look at directly. Concorde was never structured to succeed commercially. Not really. The Development Treaty of 1962 locked both governments into a program with no exit. The manufacturers needed 150 sales and received 14. The sonic boom regulations of 1973 cut nearly half the planned route network before a single passenger had boarded commercially. The American airline market, the market that would have made a global supersonic fleet viable, collapsed entirely in 1973. The aircraft spent its entire commercial life on a single transatlantic route, sustained for its first decade by direct government subsidy, surviving its second on luxury pricing, and collapsing in its third under the weight of a crash, a terrorist attack, and a structural retreat of premium aviation demand. At every critical juncture, the decisions that should have protected Concorde went the wrong way, not through malice. Through a combination of political constraint, commercial logic, and the inexorable arithmetic of running an extraordinary machine in an ordinary market. There is one number that puts the scale of the commercial failure in perspective. The manufacturers needed 150 sales to recover development costs. They sold 14 revenue aircraft. The resulting financial loss, borne almost entirely by British and French taxpayers, was one of the largest in the history of civil aviation, and yet the aircraft performed. It flew more than 50,000 hours in commercial service. It crossed the Atlantic tens of thousands of times. Every engineering promise made about what it could do, it kept. The failure was not technological. The machine worked. The failure was structural, political, economic. The project was built on assumptions about the world, about airline demand, about overland routes, about the affordability of prestige that the world refused to honor. And Concorde paid for those assumptions with its existence. Meanwhile, something important was happening in the background that almost nobody connected to the Concorde debate at the time. Other manufacturers were beginning to take supersonic civil aviation seriously again. Not immediately, not within a time frame that would have changed the 2003 decision, but the work was beginning. Research into low-boom, supersonic flight. Studies into whether the sonic boom problem that had strangled Concorde's route network could be engineered away rather than regulated away. The answer, it turned out, was yes. It just took another 2 decades to prove. On the 6th of June, 2025, the President of the United States signed an executive order directing the Federal Aviation Administration to repeal the ban on overland supersonic civil flight. The ban had been in place since 1973, 52 years. The regulation that had permanently closed half of Concorde's intended routes that had confined supersonic passenger travel to one ocean, one corridor, one class of passenger, was gone. The technology that made it possible had been developed over the intervening decades. Aircraft can now be shaped aerodynamically to reduce the sonic boom to a level indistinguishable from background noise at ground level. Companies including Boom Supersonic are advancing commercial successors to Concorde. The world is returning, slowly, to the direction Concorde pointed in 1969. But Concorde is not there to see it. The 14 revenue aircraft that flew are now in museums, in Washington, in New York, in Manchester, in Barbados, in Bristol, in Paris, their needle noses fixed in the droop position. Their engines silent. School children walk through them on class trips and ask their teachers why we stopped flying like this, and the honest answer takes longer than most school visits allow. This is the honest answer. Concorde was born out of a particular moment in Britain's national psychology, 1962. The empire was gone. Suez had humiliated the foreign policy establishment. The Americans had overtaken British manufacturing. Britain was searching for evidence that it still mattered, that it could still do something others could not. Concorde was that evidence. No other nation ran a regular supersonic passenger service. Not the Americans, who cancelled their own supersonic transport program in 1971 when Congress withdrew funding. Not the Soviets, whose Tupolev 2144, briefly called Concordesky by the press, was withdrawn from passenger service after less than a year of operation. Only Britain and France, imperfect partners, expensive alliance, holders of the one thing nobody else had managed to keep airborne. The engineers who designed Concorde understood it would not be easy. They designed it anyway. The pilots who flew it understood the weight of operating something unprecedented. They flew it anyway. And the people who stood in fields and looked up when the thunder crossed the sky, who had never flown on it and never would understood that something was up there that said something true about what human beings were capable of, when they decided to build what could not be built. That thing is now in a museum. The skies have been slower for over 20 years. The regulation that strangled Concorde has finally been lifted. The successor aircraft are being built. The direction Concorde pointed has turned out to be the right one. We just couldn't protect it long enough. If this story meant something to you, if you remember that sound crossing the sky, or if you are discovering this history for the first time, leave a comment. Tell us what Concorde means to you. Tell us if you ever saw it fly, or if someone in your family did. Subscribe to Nostalgic Britain if you haven't. Share this with someone who would want to know the truth, and we will see you in the next one.